Mayme Johnson, 58 years old, and her daughter Ruthie Johnson, 29, stood in the elegant interior of Bergman Sterling, one of Manhattan's most exclusive Fifth Avenue boutiques. Both women were impeccably dressed. Mayme in a tailored navy suit with pearl earrings that cost more than most Harlem families earned in 3 months. Ruthie in an elegant cream-colored dress with white gloves, her hair styled perfectly. They had been browsing the imported fabrics and designer evening wear for 15 minutes, examining the fall collection with the quiet confidence of women who knew quality and had money to spend. A nervous young white sales clerk had been assisting them, trying to be professional despite the obvious discomfort of serving black customers in a store that had only recently, reluctantly begun admitting them after the Civil Rights Act was signed 3 months earlier in July 1964. Then Charles Whitfield Peaton III walked through the door. Peaton was 64 years old, a real estate developer who'd inherited $12 million and built it into a $45 million Manhattan empire. He owned 19 buildings in Midtown, sat on the boards of 3 banks and 2 country clubs that still excluded black applicants through various pretexts, and was known throughout New York's business elite as someone who'd built his fortune partly by refusing to rent apartments to what he called undesirables. Black families, Puerto Rican families, anyone he considered beneath the standards of proper Manhattan society. When Peaton saw 2 well-dressed black women standing near the evening wear section while a white sales clerk attended to them, his face flushed deep red with rage. What happened next, according to 7 customers and 3 store employees who witnessed the confrontation, was a display of racist hatred so extreme that even customers who themselves harbored racist views were shocked by Peaton's behavior. Peaton strode directly toward Mayme and Ruthie, his voice rising with each step until he was shouting loudly enough that everyone in the store could hear every word. The specific racial slurs, the degrading insults, the vile characterizations that Peaton hurled at 2 women he'd never met are too offensive to print verbatim. But witnesses described language that included multiple uses of the most hateful racial epithets, explicit statements that black people had no business shopping in stores meant for white society, references to the Civil Rights Act as communist legislation destroying America, threats to have them arrested for disturbing the peace, and accusations that they must have stolen the money they were carrying because black people couldn't possibly afford Bergman Sterling's prices through legitimate means. He called them every racist name you can imagine, says Margaret Holbrook, 50, who was shopping for her granddaughter's baptism dress when the confrontation occurred. Holbrook spoke with the New York Observer on October 12, 1964. "I've lived in New York my entire life and I grew up hearing racist language. Unfortunately, it was common when I was young. But by October 1964, with everything that's happened in the civil rights movement, most people understand you can't talk like that anymore, especially not in public." But Charles Peaton didn't care. He was screaming at those 2 women, saying they were contaminating the store by their presence, demanding they leave immediately before he had them physically removed. Peaton didn't stop with verbal abuse. He grabbed a dress Ruthie had been examining, a $650 evening gown made of imported French silk, and threw it on the floor, saying it was ruined now that a black woman had touched it, and that he'd personally pay for the dress if the store would destroy it, rather than attempting to sell contaminated merchandise. The whole confrontation lasted maybe 5 minutes, but witnesses say it felt like an hour. Finally, after what witnesses estimate was 5 to 7 minutes of relentless racist abuse, Mayme Johnson took her daughter's hand and walked toward the door with her head held high, refusing to run or show anything beyond quiet dignity, despite the tears streaming down both their faces. Peaton followed them to the door, continuing to shout insults until they were outside on the sidewalk. "The last thing I heard him say," recalls Holbrook, was, "The Civil Rights Act doesn't change reality. This isn't your neighborhood, and stores like this aren't for people like you." He was standing in the doorway shouting at them as they walked away. What Charles Peaton didn't know, what nobody in Bergman Sterling knew until approximately 72 hours later, was that he had just made the worst mistake of his life. The 2 women he'd publicly degraded weren't random black shoppers he could abuse with impunity. They were the wife and daughter of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the most powerful and most dangerous criminal in Harlem, a man who'd been released from federal prison just 11 months earlier and who'd spent the past year rebuilding his criminal empire and re-establishing the network of connections that made him one of the most influential figures, criminal or legitimate, in New York City. And Bumpy Johnson was about to teach Charles Whitfield Peton III a lesson about respect that would cost Peton everything he'd spent his lifetime building. "A CTI, Daddy," he called us animals Saturday evening, October 10th, 1964. 4:30 p.m. Mayme and Ruthie arrived at Bumpy's office above the Palm Cafe on 125th Street, both still visibly shaken. Mayme tried initially to downplay the incident, not wanting to burden her husband with problems that might draw police attention just 11 months after his release from federal prison. "Mayme came in trying to act like everything was fine," says William "Bub" Hewlett, Johnson's bodyguard and close associate, who was present when they arrived. But Ruthie was still crying, and Bumpy took one. Look at his daughter's face and knew something serious had happened. When Bumpy pressed for details, Ruthie told him what happened. The white man at Bergman Sterling who'd screamed racist insults, who'd called them every vile name imaginable, who'd thrown clothing on the floor and said it was contaminated, who'd humiliated them in front of a store full of white customers who watched without helping. According to Hewlett, Johnson listened in complete silence, his face showing no emotion beyond a slight tightening around his eyes that people who knew him recognized as a sign of carefully controlled rage. When Ruthie finished, Johnson asked a single question: "Did anyone get this man's name?" Mayme mentioned that the store manager had called him Mr. Peton while trying unsuccessfully to calm him down, and that he'd mentioned owning buildings in Manhattan. Johnson nodded slowly, then said, "Go home and rest. Take care of Ruthie. Don't worry about this anymore. I'll handle it." The way Bumpy said, "I'll handle it," Hewlett recalls, his voice was so calm and so cold that I knew immediately someone was going to pay severely for what had happened. After Mayme and Ruthie left, Johnson spent the next hour making phone calls to Theodore Green, his attorney, to various business associates, to contacts who had information about Manhattan real estate and business affairs. By 6 p.m. Saturday evening, Johnson had identified Charles Whitfield Peton III, learned about his $45 million real estate empire, his racist reputation, his social connections, his business holdings, and most importantly, his vulnerabilities, the ways that someone with sufficient resources and determination could destroy everything Peton had built. Bumpy made maybe 20 phone calls Saturday evening, says Green, who spoke with the Observer on October 12th. He was gathering information, asking questions about Peton's business operations, learning who Peton's partners were, who his creditors were, what properties he owned, what debts he carried. Bumpy was doing reconnaissance, planning strategy, figuring out exactly how to hurt Peton in ways that would be devastating but that couldn't be traced back to Bumpy. What Bumpy discovered was that Peton's fortune, as large as it appeared, was actually quite vulnerable. Peton operated with massive leverage, had borrowed heavily to finance his development projects, and was dependent on continued bank financing to maintain his operations. By Sunday morning, October 11th, Johnson had developed a comprehensive plan for destroying Charles Peton's business empire, his social standing, and his reputation. The plan would unfold over 72 hours and would involve Johnson's criminal organization, his legitimate business contacts, his political connections, and his understanding of how Manhattan's business elite operated in the new reality of post-Civil Rights Act America. Bumpy's genius wasn't just that he was willing to hurt people who hurt his family, Green explains. His genius was that he understood exactly how to hurt them in ways that were proportionate to their offense, that were devastating to them personally, and that couldn't be easily traced back to him. A CT2, the 72-hour campaign. Sunday, October 11th, Tuesday, October 13th, 1964, Johnson spent approximately $75,000 over the next 72 hours, not on bribes or illegal activities, but on legitimate business transactions and strategic interventions that were perfectly legal, but deployed with surgical precision to damage Peton's business interests. The bank connections. Johnson had relationships with 3 banks that did business in Harlem and that also held substantial loans for Piton's development projects. Through intermediaries, Johnson arranged for these banks to receive detailed financial analyses of Piton's holdings. Bumpy had his people create analyses that were completely accurate, says Green. They didn't contain any false information, but they emphasized the risks in Piton's highly leveraged positions, noted that several of his development projects were behind schedule and over budget, and most importantly pointed out that Piton's public racist behavior on October 10th violated the spirit of the Civil Rights Act and could expose any bank doing business with him to negative publicity and potential legal complications. By Monday morning, all 3 banks had initiated reviews of Piton's loans, not because they'd been ordered to, but because the information Johnson provided had made loan officers nervous about their institution's exposure to a developer who appeared overextended and who demonstrated the kind of public racism that was increasingly toxic in October 1964. The civil rights mobilization, through contacts and civil rights organizations he'd supported financially, Johnson arranged for Peton to become a target of civil rights activism, not through violence or illegal harassment, but through completely legal protests, boycotts, and public attention. Bumpy contacted representatives from CORE, from the NAACP, from local civil rights groups, says Reverend James Mitchell, 71, a Harlem minister who worked closely with civil rights organizations. Bumpy provided detailed information about Piton's racist business practices, his refusal to rent to black families, his history of discrimination, the public incident at Bergman Sterling, and Bumpy offered to fund organizing efforts targeting Peton's properties and businesses. At 9 a.m. on Monday, October 12th, approximately 50 protesters organized by CORE and the NAACP gathered outside Peton's largest residential building, carrying signs that read, "Peton discriminates against black tenants and racist landlord violates civil rights, ACT." Similar protests occurred at 2 other Peton properties on Monday, creating the appearance of major controversy surrounding Peton's business practices. The business partner pressure. Through his network, Johnson arranged for Piton's business partners to receive information suggesting that Piton's public racism was about to become a major liability, that civil rights organizations were planning to target Peton's properties, and that partners might want to reconsider their investments before the negative attention affected their own reputations. The information wasn't threats and wasn't false, Green explains. It was accurate reporting about what civil rights organizations were actually planning to do, combined with suggestions that remaining partnered with Piton while he was being targeted for racism might not be good for the partners' own businesses. The media campaign Johnson had relationships with several black newspapers and with white journalists who covered Harlem and civil rights issues. Through these contacts, Johnson arranged for stories about the Bergman Sterling incident and Piton's history of racist business practices. The New York Amsterdam News ran a front-page story on Sunday titled, "Manhattan Developer Screams Racist Abuse at Black Shoppers." The New York Times ran a story on Monday titled "Allegations of Discrimination at Fifth Avenue Boutique Following Confrontation." The tenant organization Johnson funded organizers who helped coordinate tenants living in Peton's buildings, tenants who'd been tolerating substandard maintenance and discriminatory practices because they had limited alternative housing options. On Monday evening, approximately 200 tenants from 9 of Piton's buildings met at a Harlem church and formed a tenant organization that announced it would begin collective action, rent strikes, complaints to city housing authorities, legal challenges, unless Piton immediately improved conditions and stopped discrimination. The country club problem through intermediaries, Johnson arranged for Piton's 2 country clubs to receive detailed documentation about Piton's October 10th behavior, about the civil rights protests, and about the media attention. The country clubs were in extremely delicate positions in October 1964, Green explains. The Civil Rights Act had passed 3 months earlier. Clubs were facing pressure to integrate what Peton had done, screaming racist abuse at black women in public, was exactly the kind of behavior that made clubs vulnerable to criticism and legal challenges. By Monday evening, one country club had asked Piton to resign his membership. The second club placed Piton's membership under review, a CT3. The collapse Tuesday morning, October 13, 1964. By Tuesday morning, the cumulative pressure from multiple simultaneous fronts had created a genuine crisis for Piton's business operations. Two of the three banks decided to call their loans, demanding immediate repayment of $9 million total, based on clauses allowing banks to demand repayment if they determined the borrower's financial condition had deteriorated or if the borrower's public behavior created reputational risks. The loans were technically callable, Green explains. Bumpy's information campaign had convinced the banks that Piton's highly leveraged position, combined with the civil rights protests and media attention, created unacceptable risks. Piton didn't have $9 million in liquid assets to repay the loans immediately, which meant he'd have to sell properties quickly at disadvantageous prices. Four of Piton's business partners announced on Tuesday that they were withdrawing from joint development projects, citing concerns about negative publicity. The tenant organization announced a rent strike in four of Piton's buildings, affecting approximately $60,000 in monthly revenue. Several prominent Manhattan families who'd previously socialized with Piton began quietly distancing themselves, declining dinner invitations, making clear through subtle but unmistakable signals that Piton's public display of racism had made him socially unacceptable. By Tuesday, everyone in our social circle knew what Charles had done on Saturday, says Holbrook. In October 1964, you simply can't behave that way anymore without consequences. Charles's behavior would have been more tolerated in 1954, but in 1964, it's unacceptable. A CT4, who did this to me? Wednesday, October 14, 1964. 2:30 p.m. By Wednesday morning, Charles Piton's business empire was in genuine crisis. He spent the morning making frantic phone calls trying to determine why everything had collapsed simultaneously. Then Theodore Green walked into Piton's Midtown Manhattan office. I walked in at about 2:30 p.m., Green told the Observer. Piton looked terrible, hadn't shaved, was wearing the same suit for 2 days. When I introduced myself as an attorney representing certain Harlem business interests, he barely looked up. He said, "Whatever you're selling, I'm not interested. I'm dealing with multiple crises." Green's response, "I know. I'm here to explain why you're dealing with multiple crises simultaneously." Green then explained that the collapse wasn't coincidental. It was orchestrated retaliation for what Piton had done to Mayme and Ruthie Johnson at Bergman Sterling. I told him, "Last Saturday you publicly humiliated two black women at a Fifth Avenue boutique. Those two women were the wife and daughter of Ellsworth Johnson, who controls substantial business interests in Harlem and who has extensive connections throughout New York's business, political, and civil rights communities. Mr. Johnson was displeased by how you treated his family. What's happened to you over the past 4 days? The bank loan calls, the partner withdrawals, the civil rights protests, the media attention, the social ostracism. That was Mr. Johnson teaching you a lesson about respect." According to Green, Piton's face went white. He said, "That's impossible. Bumpy Johnson is a criminal. He has no power over banks and country clubs." Green's response, "Mr. Johnson has relationships throughout this city that you apparently never suspected existed. He has contacts in every community. He has influence that extends far beyond the criminal underworld. And when someone hurts his family, Mr. Johnson uses every resource available to him to ensure that person regrets their actions. Welcome to October 1964, Mr. Piton. The Civil Rights Act means something now." Piton asked what he could do to make it stop. Green's answer was simple: nothing. The damage is done. Your loans are called. Your partners have withdrawn. Your social standing is destroyed. Mr. Johnson isn't interested in your apologies or your money. He's already accomplished what he set out to accomplish. Before leaving, Green delivered Johnson's final message. "Oh, and Mr. Piton, Mr. Johnson wants you to know that his wife and daughter are going to return to Bergman and Sterling next Saturday, October 17th, and if anyone treats them with anything less than complete respect, what's happened to you this week will seem minor compared to what happens next. Do you understand? Peyton reportedly just nodded, too shocked to respond. A CT5, the return Saturday, October 17, 1964, 2:45 p.m. Exactly 1 week after the original incident, Mayme and Ruthie Johnson returned to Bergman Sterling. They were accompanied by Theodore Green and William Hewlett, who positioned themselves near the entrance. Also present were approximately 30 members of CORE and the NAACP who'd come to observe and ensure no harassment occurred. The return visit proceeded very differently. The store manager greeted Mayme and Ruthie personally at the door, apologizing profusely for what had happened, explaining that Mr. Peyton was no longer welcome at Bergman Sterling and had been permanently banned, assuring them that all black customers would be welcomed with complete courtesy going forward. 3 sales clerks attended to them throughout their 90-minute shopping visit, showing them the finest selections, treating them with elaborate courtesy normally reserved for the store's wealthiest customers regardless of race. Other customers went out of their way to be friendly, making polite conversation, making clear through their behavior that black customers were welcome. The difference was extraordinary, says Holbrook, who witnessed the return visit. Last week, those 2 women were subjected to horrific racist abuse while we all stood by. This week, they were treated like royalty. I personally introduced myself to Mrs. Johnson and apologized for not defending them on October 10th. She was very gracious, said she appreciated the apology, and hoped what had happened would lead to changes benefiting all black shoppers. Mayme and Ruthie purchased approximately $1,500 worth of clothing and accessories. The store manager personally wrapped their purchases and walked them to the door, again apologizing and inviting them to return any time. Outside, the CORE and NAACP members who'd been observing applauded as Mayme and Ruthie exited carrying their shopping bags, a gesture of solidarity and celebration that black women could now shop at exclusive Fifth Avenue boutiques without fear of racist harassment. Epilogue: The cost of racism. Charles Whitfield Peyton III never recovered from the 72-hour systematic destruction of his business empire and social standing. By December 1964, he'd been forced to sell 14 of his 19 buildings at substantial losses to cover the loan calls. His net worth declined from an estimated $45 million in October 1964 to approximately $11 million by February 1965, a loss of $34 million in 4 months. The social ostracism continued indefinitely. He was permanently expelled from both country clubs. His wife filed for separation in January 1965, citing her inability to show her face in Manhattan society after her husband had become synonymous with racist hatred. In the new civil rights era, Peyton attempted to rebuild his business reputation in 1965 and 1966, but found his name had become toxic. Banks were reluctant to lend. Partners were unwilling to invest. He died of a heart attack in April 1968, at age 68, essentially forgotten by the society that had once embraced him. What Bumpy did to Peyton became legendary, says Reverend Mitchell. Criminals saw it as proof that Bumpy Johnson's power extended far beyond Harlem. Civil rights activists saw it as a perfect example of how the Civil Rights Act could be enforced through strategic economic pressure. Peyton learned too late that October 1964 is different from October 1954, that treating black people with racist contempt carries consequences that can destroy everything you've built. The destruction of Peyton created ripple effects throughout Manhattan's retail and real estate industries. Several exclusive stores that had been slow to implement Civil Rights Act requirements began actively welcoming black shoppers. Bergman Sterling hired its first black sales clerk in November 1964 and began advertising in black newspapers that all customers would be served with equal courtesy. Bumpy didn't set out to integrate Manhattan stores, says Green. He set out to hurt the man who'd hurt his family. But by destroying Peyton so publicly and so completely, Bumpy inadvertently accelerated integration. Stores integrated faster in late 1964 and 1965, partly because the Civil Rights Act required it, but also partly because businessmen who'd seen what happened to Peyton understood that racism could be expensive when it offended people who had the resources to fight back. Bumpy Johnson never publicly acknowledged his role in destroying Charles Peyton's fortune. When contacted by the Observer, Johnson declined comment through his attorney, who issued a written statement. Mr. Johnson has no knowledge of Mr. Peyton's business difficulties. Mr. Johnson supports the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and believes all Americans should be treated with equal dignity and respect. Any businessman who violates the Civil Rights Act should expect to face appropriate legal and economic consequences. But among Johnson's associates, there was no ambiguity about what had happened. Bumpy never talked about what he did to Peyton, says Hewlett. He didn't brag, didn't seek credit, didn't want publicity. But everyone close to Bumpy knew. Peyton insulted Bumpy's wife and daughter on October 10th. Within 72 hours, Peyton's entire world collapsed. The message was obvious: don't hurt Bumpy Johnson's family unless you're prepared to lose everything you value. The story spread through Harlem, through New York's criminal underworld, and through the civil rights movement as an example of how power can be deployed effectively to enforce civil rights when legal remedies alone are insufficient. A wealthy white racist humiliated two black women in a Fifth Avenue store on October 10, 1964, not knowing they were connected to someone with the resources to fight back. Within 1 week, that racist had lost $34 million, his social standing, his business partnerships, and his place in Manhattan society. And two black women returned to the store where they'd been humiliated, where they were welcomed and served with respect, where they shopped surrounded by white customers who treated them as equals. That was the lesson Charles Peyton learned too late, that October 1964 is different from October 1954, that the Civil Rights Act has changed the rules, and that Bumpy Johnson, despite being a criminal, despite having just been released from federal prison 11 months earlier, had more real power to enforce civil rights than most of Manhattan's wealthy white elite could imagine. The insult that Peyton thought he could deliver with impunity cost him everything he'd spent his lifetime building, all because Bumpy Johnson understood something that Charles Peyton never learned, that real power in October 1964 isn't about who you can hurt without consequences. It's about making sure that people who violate civil rights and hurt what you value pay prices they can't afford.